a few moments to make my argument to you. I would be a rich man if I had a quarter for every time that I've listened to my Republican colleagues on the Foreign Relations Committee utter some variation of the sentence, President Obama doesn't have a strategy to defeat ISIS. It's their calling card on the committee. It's also their calling card, as you saw last night in the debate. But it's not true. The president does have a strategy to defeat ISIS, and it is largely working on the ground today. ISIS's territory in Iraq and Syria has been reduced by 30% over the last year. We've tightened our immigration policies to make sure that the bad guys don't get in. We've stood up a more capable fighting force in Iraq. We've squeezed their financing networks. Now, it's hard to win when only one spectacular and deadly strike can erase all of your good work, but the president does have a strategy. The problem is, and this is what I want to talk to you about today, the problem is it is still a short-term strategy. What I want to say today is that one of the reasons that really no one has a particularly credible long-term strategy is that having one would involve some very uncomfortable truths being talked about the nature of the fight ahead of us and about the imperfections of one of our most important allies in the Middle East. And so to make this case to you, I want to bring you to a small town in northwest Pakistan and ask you to imagine for a moment that you're the parent of a little boy there. You're illiterate, you're poor, you're getting poorer by the day. Unemployment in your village is sky high. Inflation is making everything unaffordable. Your crop yields have been terrible. And one day you get a visit that changes your perspective. A cleric from a nearby conservative mosque offers you a different path. He tells you that your poverty is not your fault, but simply a punishment handed down to you because of your unintentional deviation from the true path of Islam. And luckily, there's a way to get right with God, to devote your son's life to Islam. And it gets even better, because the cleric's going to educate your son at his own school. We call them madrasas. And not only will you not have to pay for the education, he'll actually pay you, sometimes as much as $6,000. And when your son finishes school, he'll get employment in the service of Islam. Your 10-year-old, previously destined to lead a life possibly more hopeless than yours, is now going to get free housing and meals, religious instruction, a promise of a job when he's older, and you're going to get money and improved favor with God. And so for thousands of families in destitute places like northwest Pakistan, it's a pretty easy choice. But as you go on, you lose contact with your son. Gradually, the school cuts off your access to him. When you do see him now and again, he's changing. And then one day it's over. He's not the little boy you once knew. He's a teenager announcing to you that the only way to show true faith to Islam is to fight for it against the kafirs, the infidels who are trying to pollute the Muslim faith, and against the Westerners who are trying to destroy it. He tells you that he's going off to Afghanistan or Syria or Iraq with some fellow students, and that you shouldn't worry about him because God is on his side. And you start asking questions to find out, well, what happened at this school? And you start to learn. You discover the textbooks that he read that taught a brand of Islam greatly influenced by something called Wahhabism, a strain of Islam based on the earliest form of religion practiced by the first four caliphs. It holds that any deviation from Islamic originalism is heresy. In school, your son was therefore taught an ideology of hate towards unbelievers. Now, these are Christians, Jews, Hindus, but also Shiites, Sufis, and Sunni Muslims who don't follow the Wahhabi doctrine. He's told that the Crusades never ended, that aid organizations, schools, government offices, they're the modern weapons of the West's continuing crusade against his faith, and that it's a religious obligation to do battle against the infidels. I tell you this story because, as you know, some version of it plays out hundreds of times every day in far-flung places, from Pakistan to Kosovo, from Nigeria to Indonesia. The teaching of an intolerant version of Islam to hundreds of millions of young people. In 1956, there were 244 madrasas in Pakistan. Today, there are 24,000. These schools are multiplying all over the globe. And don't get me wrong, these schools, by and large, they don't teach violence. They aren't the minor leagues for extremist groups, but they do teach a version of Islam that leads very nicely into an anti-Shia, anti-Western militancy. And I also don't try to make the case here today that Wahhabism is the only sect of Islam that can be perverted into violence. Iran's Shia clerics also use religion in order to export violence into Syria and Iraq and Lebanon. But it's important to note that the terrorist groups that Americans know by name are Sunni in derivation and are greatly influenced by Wahhabi Salafist teachings. And of course, the real rub is that we've known this. We've known it for a long, long time. Secretaries of state, ambassadors, diplomats, four-star generals, they've all complained over and over again about it, and yet we do very little to stop this slow spread of intolerance. And we don't address it because to do so would cause us to confront two very difficult issues. The first is how we talk sensibly about Islam. Right now, we are caught between two extremes. Leading Republicans want to begin and end this discussion with a debate over just simply what we call terrorists. And of course, their party's leading candidate for president, Donald Trump, equates the entire religion with violence. The debate over nomenclature is overwrought, but I certainly understand the problem of labeling something radical Islamic terrorism, giving purchase to Trump's unforgivable argument that all Muslims are radicals or terrorists. Republicans don't want to seem to go any deeper into the conversation than just a simple labeling of the threat. But Democrats also have to look inward as well. The leaders of my party do backflips to avoid using these kind of terms. But that ends up forestalling any conversation about the fight within Islam for the soul of the religion. It's a disservice to the debate for Republicans to simply brand every Muslim as a threat to the West, but it's also a disservice for Democrats to refuse to acknowledge that though ISIS has perverted Islam to a degree that is unrecognizable, the seeds of that perversion are rooted in a much more mainstream version of the faith that derives in substantial part from the teachings of Wahhabism. Leaders of both parties should avoid the extremes of this debate and enter into a real conversation about how America can help win the moderate voices within Islam, help them win out over those who would sow the seeds of extremism. And let me give you an example. Last fall, I visited the Hidayah Center in Abu Dhabi, which is a U.S.-supported, Arab-led initiative to counter-program against extremist messaging. And when I pressed the center's leadership on the need to confront Wahhabi teaching and these roots of extremism, they blanched. They said it was out of their lane, they told me. They were focused on the branches of extremism, not the trunk. But of course, by then, it's often too late. Now, America doesn't have the moral authority by ourselves to tip the scales in the fight between moderate Islam and less tolerant Islam. Muslim communities and Muslim nations need to be the leading edge of this fight, but America, and most notably sometimes the leaders of my party, we can't afford to just shut our eyes to the struggle that's playing out in real time throughout the Muslim world. And so that brings me to my second uncomfortable truth. And I present it to you in a quote from Farah Pandith, who was President Obama's former special representative to Muslim communities. In a moment of candor, she commented on the over 60 countries that she has visited as part of her official position. She said, in every place that I visited, the Wahhabi influence was an insidious presence, funded by Saudi money. The second uncomfortable truth is that for all of the positive aspects of our alliance with Saudi Arabia, there is another side to Saudi Arabia than the one that faces us in our bilateral relationship, and it is a side that we can no longer afford to ignore as our fight against Islamic extremism becomes more focused and more complicated. Now, first, let me acknowledge that there is a lot to like about our relationship with Saudi Arabia. I don't agree with the cynics who just say that our relationship is an alliance to facilitate the exchange of oil for cash and cash for weapons. Our common bond, it was formed back in the Cold War when American and Saudi leaders found common ground in the fight against communism. The Saudis helped the U.S. ensure that the Russians never really got a meaningful foothold in the Middle East. The unofficial detente between Sunni nations and Israel, our most important ally in the region, is in part a product of Saudi-led diplomacy. There have been many high-profile examples of deep U.S.-Saudi cooperation in the fight against al-Qaeda and ISIS. And more generally, our partnership with Saudi Arabia, the most powerful, richest country in the Arab world, it serves as an important bridge to the Islamic community. It's a testament to the fact that we seek cooperation and engagement with governments in the Middle East. And it's a direct rebuttal of the terrorist ideology that asserts that we seek war with Islam. But increasingly, there are more and more things not to like about the state of our relationship. The political alliance between the House of Saud and the conservative Wahhabi clerics is as old as the nation, and the alliance has resulted in billions funneled to and through the Wahhabi movement. Those 24,000 religious schools in Pakistan, thousands of them are funded by money that originates in Saudi Arabia. According to some estimates, since the 1960s, the Saudis have funneled over $100 billion into funding schools and mosques all over the world with the mission of spreading puritanical Wahhabism. As a point of comparison, researchers estimate that the Soviet Union spent only about $7 billion exporting its communist ideology from the entire period running from 1920 to 1991. Less well-funded governments and other strains of Islam, they just can't keep up with the tsunami of money. Now, rightfully, we engage in daily castigations of Iran for sponsoring terrorism throughout the region. But why has Saudi Arabia been largely immune from direct public criticism from political leaders simply because they are a few degrees separated from the terrorists who are often inspired by the ideology their money helps to spread? And why do we say virtually nothing about the human rights abuses inside Saudi Arabia, fueled by this conservative religious movement, when we so easily call out other countries for similar outrageous behavior? So we need to have a reckoning with the Saudis, but it also needs to be on a second topic, and that's their increasing proxy war with Iran. There is more than enough blame to go around in assessing the damage done by the widening Saudi-Iranian fault lines in the Middle East. And I'd argue that the lion's share of fault lies with the Iranians. It's been the Iranians who have destabilized places like Lebanon and Iraq. It's the Iranians that are propping up a murderous regime in Damascus. But in the wake of the Iran nuclear agreement, there are many in Congress who would have the United States double down in our support for the Saudi side of this fight in places like Yemen and Syria, simply because Saudi Arabia is our named friend and Iran is our named enemy. But the Middle East doesn't work like that anymore. And there is growing evidence that our support for Saudi-led military campaigns in places like Yemen are prolonging humanitarian misery and aiding extremism. $90 billion in U.S. arms sales to the Saudis have helped Saudi Arabia carry out a campaign in Yemen against the Iranian-backed Houthis. Our government says that its top priority in Yemen is defeating AQAP, which is arguably al-Qaeda's deadliest franchise. But this ongoing chaos, it's created a security vacuum in which AQAP can thrive and can actually expand. No expert would dispute that since the Saudi campaign began, al-Qaeda has expanded in Yemen, and ISIL has gained a new terrorist and recruitment foothold. And to make matters worse, Saudi Arabia and some of their GCC allies are so focused on the fight against Iran and Yemen that they have dramatically scaled back, or in some cases completely abandoned, their military effort against ISIS. So how, under these circumstances, does military support for these campaigns help us in our fight against extremism? So my recommendation here is simple. The United States should suspend supporting Saudi Arabia's military campaign in Yemen, at the very least until we get assurances that this campaign does not distract from the fight against ISIS and al-Qaeda, and until we make some progress in the Saudi export of Wahhabism. And Congress shouldn't sign off on any more military sales to Saudi Arabia until similar assurances are granted. If we are serious about constructing a winning strategy to defeat ISIS and al-Qaeda, then our horizons, they do have to involve a strategy that looks beyond just the day-to-day, the here and now, the fight in Iraq and Syria. And we need to admit that there is a fight for the future of Islam, that we can't just sit on the sidelines of that. Both parties in Washington need to acknowledge this reality, and we need to talk reasonably about how the U.S. can engage with moderate forces. And we need to be careful about not just blindly backing our friends' plays and conflicts that simply create more instability, more political insecurity vacuums into which ISIS and other extremist groups can fill, like what's going on in Yemen today. Tackling intolerant ideologies, refusing to incentivize destabilizing proxy wars, these are the elements of a long-term anti-extremist strategy. And we should pursue this strategy even if it makes us, on occasion, very uncomfortable. I thank you for giving me the time to lay this argument out to you. I know we will get to cover a lot of other topics in